I'm Eleanor, though everyone calls me Elle, a 29-year-old interior designer etching my name into Portland's misty skyline with every sleek condo I craft. Life spun fast with sketches and dreams until a stabbing pain buckled me in a rain-soaked parking lot, appendicitis ripping through my gut. Surgery patched me up, but the real wound came later. Marcus, my husband of 6 years, emptied our accounts while I recovered, stitched and helpless. He never suspected my secret stash, cash from late-night gigs, or the recordings I'd saved of his slippery lies. Weeks later, I faced him in a foggy old-town cafe, turning his sneaky recording trick against him with proof that sent him to jail. His betrayal sliced deep, yet I fought my way free. Curious how I spun his collapse into my triumph, come hear my story unfold. I stood in the polished hush of a client's penthouse, my latest design stretching across Portland's skyline like a bold signature of my 29 years. The condo gleamed with glass walls and steel edges, catching the fading drizzle of late afternoon, and the client's praise rolled over me, warm and crackling, a spark I chased with every sketch. I'd burned weeks on this, hunched over my desk past midnight, and their wide-eyed nods made it worth every bleary hour. Down in the downtown parking lot, Sophie leaned against my car, her grin slicing through the damp gray like a lifeline. We traded quick laughs about the project, her calm voice steadying me in the swirl of my relentless days, a bond carved from years of spilled coffee and late-night deadlines. I drove home through the slick streets, my head still humming, and stepped into our cramped apartment where Marcus sprawled on the couch. His eyes stayed locked on his phone, fingers flicking through some startup hustle, and he tossed a vague, big plans my way without looking up. I barely nodded, too drained to push, my trust stitched from 6 years of him, back when he'd map out wild dreams with me over cheap beer at 23. That Marcus had been my tether, all fire and promise, and I held tight to his echo, even as he dulled. I kicked off my shoes, craving sleep, when a sharp jolt sliced through my side. My breath snagged, the pain coiling tighter, and I gripped the counter, dizzy. Marcus glanced up, muttered, "You okay?" Then sank back into his screen as I stumbled toward the door. I thought the cold air might dull it, so I pushed outside, each step a wobble, but the ache flared fiercer, a blade twisting in my gut. My knees buckled on the wet asphalt of our building's lot, and I hit the ground with a ragged gasp, rain stinging my face. The world spun, my hands clawing at the pavement, and I barely heard Marcus's faint call from inside. Too late. Too little. Sophie's car screeched in, her headlights cutting the blur, and her shout broke through as she leapt out. She grabbed my arms, hauling me up with fierce urgency, her panic a lifeline as my grip faded. The pain roared, a signal I couldn't decode, and as she shoved me into her passenger seat, I knew something bigger than my blueprints was cracking open. I drifted awake in a Portland hospital room, the sharp bite of antiseptic jolting me as a muted throb simmered beneath the haze of fading drugs. My side felt bound, a tight coil where the surgeons had rooted out the culprit, and a nurse's brisk words cut through the fog, explaining appendicitis had dragged me under the knife and pieced me back together. I murmured thanks, my head swimming, yet eased, grateful for the hands that steadied my fall. That morning, Marcus ambled in, his sneakers scraping the floor, a lukewarm coffee cup clutched loosely in his fist like a prop he'd forgotten to use. He stooped to press a dry kiss to my cheek, his breath stale with yesterday's gum, and grumbled about a pitch before slipping out, the cup abandoned to pool condensation on the tray. A quiet ache flared in me, not from the stitches, and I saw him at 25, his grin fierce over a campfire's glow, swearing we'd conquer the world side by side. That spark seemed a distant flicker now, buried under a frost I couldn't place, and I lay there, too muddled to chase the thought. The room loomed, its pale walls a blank slate mirroring the blur in my chest, and I shifted, the staples pulling with a dull sting. Later that afternoon, Sophie eased through the door, her boots whispering on the tiles, and settled beside me with a lopsided smirk. She teased about my gown's drab stripes, claiming they'd clash with my next design, and her easy tone washed over the room's chill, a lifeline I didn't know I needed. Marcus's swift retreat echoed in me, a shadow heavier than the ache beneath my ribs, and I watched her fingers trace idle patterns on the chair's arm, anchoring me in their calm. She lingered, spinning tales of office quirks, her words a soft ripple against the unease pooling inside, and I leaned into them, letting her pull me from the murk. A vague restlessness stirred, something unspoken tugging at the edges of my trust, and though my mind couldn't grip it, I felt the first splinters pierce the picture I'd held of us. The steady beep of machines blurred into a murmur, and I sensed a fracture forming, faint but growing, daring me to peer through it soon. 3 days after the surgeon's blade had its way, I hovered in my hospital bed, a brittle frame cradled by pillows with the soreness in my side softened to a faint ember under the hum of painkillers. The room bathed in the tender blush of dawn spilling through the slats, painting frail streaks across the rumpled sheets, and I curled my fingers, coaxing the faint vigor trickling back into them. My phone jolted awake on the tray just past dawn, Marcus's name pulsing on the screen, and I picked up, his voice gliding through too smooth, a glossy ribbon of talk about managing our money that sent a shiver skittering down my spine. I offered faint hums, my thoughts tangling in his sheen, and when the line went quiet, a restless murmur bloomed within me, nudging me to probe. I balanced the phone on my lap, its light stark against the muted glow, and sweat slicked my palms as I tapped into our accounts with unsteady fingers. The truth glared back, a yawning chasm where our savings had thrived, cards bled dry to their edges, and a frost seeped into my veins, colder than the pull of my tender wound. He'd hollowed us out while I lingered here, bound to this sterile cage, and the sting of his deceit wrapped tight around my lungs, stealing the air with every shallow draw. I let the phone slip, my heartbeat a wild drum against my ribs, and a whisper of memory rose, gentle yet unyielding, tugging me to 25. I'd sprawled on our threadbare rug, Marcus striding back and forth as he spun tales of a golden venture, his fervor crackling in the air, and I'd hit record on a whim, half lulled, half guarded. That moment lit a spark, a silent vow to funnel my own profits from sleepless designs into a veiled vault, a tether I'd spun across 4 years of quiet caution. I peered out at the city's outline, its contours blurred in the early haze, and my pulse found its rhythm, a steely resolve piercing the mist. This wasn't merely a wound, it was a seam I could tug, a chance to unspool his tangle before he sensed my grip on the unraveling thread. The hospital's soft drone melted away, drowned by the rising tide of my own reckoning, and I cradled that buried strength, a bulwark shaped in silence, certain I wasn't the wraith he'd cast aside. Early that morning, a week after the surgeon's deft hands had mended me, I slipped from the hospital's sterile embrace, my frame brittle but stirring, a vessel braced by the fading pulse of ibuprofen I downed like sour oaths. The air outside nipped at my skin, Portland's jagged skyline piercing a sky streaked with violet, and I eased into my car, the soreness a hushed murmur as I curled my fingers around the wheel. I veered past the pole of our apartment, guiding my path instead to the Pearl District, where my lawyer's office rose, its sleek panes shimmering like a quiet pledge. Inside, I sank into a chair, my evidence binder a solid weight pressed against my thighs, and unveiled the intricate weave of Marcus's treachery before her sharp gaze. Doctored ledgers, pilfered sums, 6 years of his guile captured in crisp lines, anchored by that initial recording of his brash swagger. I etched my name across papers with unwavering resolve, threading my covert gains and lawful holdings into an ironclad bastion under my sole claim, each mark a knot barring him from reach. The room thrummed with the muted tap of her keys, but my thoughts drifted to those twilight hours, bent over my desk in our worn flat while Marcus snored, heedless. I'd crafted blueprints under the glow of a single bulb, striking pacts with clients I kept nameless to him, channeling my art into a silent uprising that fattened my shrouded reserve over 4 years. Every deal I'd buried, every coin I'd diverted, gleamed now as a lifeline I'd braided not from dread, but from a flicker of intuition I'd scarcely owned then. I saw it vivid, those stolen nights weaving a bulwark beneath the world he thought he'd bound, a resistance I'd draped in stillness until this day unfurled its might. I emerged from her office, the binder a lighter burden in my grip, and set out west toward the Columbia River Gorge, its untamed expanse rolling open beyond the glass as I nursed my mending form. The road unfurled, a slender vein winding through towering pines, and I crept along, my breath hitching with each curve, the ache a steady shadow I could outrun. This wasn't flight, but renewal, each mile a beat of my own forging, tracing a course not to him, but to the life I'd seize. The city's clamor shrank in my wake, overtaken by the deep sigh of the wilderness, and I drew in the scent of resin and liberty, certain I'd spun his pillage into my dominion. I envisioned Marcus striding into our apartment, his gait brimming with swagger until he stabbed at his laptop, only to unearth the account sealed shut, a desolate crypt where his dominion once towered. The scene played vivid in my head, his brow furrowing as the screen stripped his throne bare, while I settled into my retreat, a timber refuge cradled by Oregon's rugged shore where waves thrashed against the cliffs below vast windows. I'd shaped this sanctum at 27, its frame born from my clandestine labor, and now it embraced me, the briny gusts curling through the sills as I brushed my hand along its smooth contours, my side a fleeting murmur of strain. My phone quivered with his calls, a desperate thrum across the wood, but I left them to dissolve into silence, shifting gingerly to sip chamomile that warmed the faint echoes of pain, relishing the subtle victory in each sip. The next evening, Sophie's tires ground against the pebbled path, and she crossed the threshold, her eyes ablaze with a spark I'd missed until now. She dropped onto the sofa beside me, her tone hushed as she unfurled her tale. She'd trailed Marcus's scheme since I'd muttered about that gilded promise he'd boasted of years ago, feeding me clues I'd knitted into my armor without grasping her quiet vigilance. Her words struck like a pebble tossed into a calm pond, sending shivers through my core, and I gazed at her, my unwavering sentinel who'd shielded me in ways I'd never mapped. We lingered in the flicker of a lone bulb, the sea's ceaseless chant seeping through the planks, and I smiled, savoring the bitter edge of his collapse from this far-flung haven, his dread a scent I could nearly catch on the breeze. The retreat cradled me, its sturdy grain a rampart against the world I'd cast off, and I sank deeper into the cushions, my breath even as the surf beyond. I couldn't yet gauge the full measure of his descent, the legal coils winding tighter around his throat, but I sensed the tilt, a scepter toppling from his clutch while I stood beyond his shadow. This was no longer his realm, and I'd shed the mantle of his quarry, my foundation striking deep into this earth I'd claimed, unbowed by the tempest I knew loomed for him. 2 weeks after the surgeon's skilled hands had knit me back together, I reclined in my coastal retreat, the sea's ceaseless murmur weaving through the timber when my phone quivered with a voicemail, Marcus's voice leaking out, frail and beseeching for a chance to untangle his supposed blunder. His tone trembled, a brittle shell cloaking the panic I could almost touch, and though Sophie's caution echoed from her morning call, her resolute words pressing me to hold firm, a stubborn flame flickered inside, yearning to witness his faltering mask. I journeyed back to Portland, my side a soft whisper beneath the calm cadence of my lungs, and by late afternoon, I faced him in a mist-shrouded cafe in Old Town, its panes clouded with the city's exhale. He hunched across the table, his glance skittish as he wove a brittle tale of botched ventures and hollow vows, his fingers grazing a phone that shimmered faintly beneath the table's rim, its quiet gleam unmasking his scheme to ensnare me. I lifted my coffee, my hand steadied on the cup as its dark heat anchored me, and let him ramble, his words a frail vine buckling under the burden of his deceit, until I tilted closer, my eyes pinning his. I spoke low and certain, unveiling that I'd snared his every twisted pledge, from that bold swagger at 25 to the whispered evasions of recent weeks, my own recordings a taut snare I'd kept coiled in wait. His visage blanched, a veil torn free as the air grew dense around us, and I stood, the chairs scrape a sharp coda on the weathered boards. I'd gathered those shards across years, echoes of his brazen claims snatched from restless nights and unguarded boasts, a mosaic of his downfall I'd pieced with care, now unleashed to crush his ruse. The cafe's clamor engulfed his stillness as I stepped into the haze, the city's rhythm surging beneath my feet, my pace solid despite the gentle tug beneath my stitches. I'd sought him not to mend, but to cleave, turning his ploy into my verdict, and the mist parted as I moved, a curtain rising on the ruin he'd reaped. The ocean's distant song receded, overtaken by the crisp bite of twilight streets, and I bore that triumph. A spark flared into a blaze, certain I'd raised his foothold to cinders. I anchored myself in my coastal retreat, the morning sun weaving amber tendrils across the broad timbers of my haven as the ocean's ceaseless sigh drifted through the open panes. 3 weeks had slipped by since the surgeon's deft touch, and the subtle tug beneath my ribs had faded to a whisper, a remnant I'd outrun with patience and grit. I'd forged this refuge, its solid bones a monument to my hidden years, and it cradled me now, a stronghold awash in radiance where echoes of doubt once roamed. That evening, Sophie swept in, her laughter rippling through the air as she brandished a bottle of tawny ale, its earthy aroma blending with the zest of seared thyme from the meal I'd left bubbling on the range. We sat at the table, the chime of our glasses a salute to the ties we'd tempered, her spirit a vibrant stream that polished the rough scars of my journey. She wove tales of office quirks and fleeting joys, her words a luminous cord binding up the past's frayed ends, and I sank into the comfort, the feast a quiet salve for the wars I'd weathered. Later, as the hearth's embers glowed soft, a radio sputtered awake in the corner, its crackle yielding to a report of Marcus's arrest, his name ensnared in a lattice of fraud charges that had finally bound him. I paused, my fork stilled midair, the news a faint ripple across the calm I'd built, and it settled in me, a muted knell against the serenity I'd shaped, stirring no thrill, only the soft click of a latch I'd left unfastened. The sea crooned outside, its timeless cadence a pulse I'd claimed as my own, and I reached for my sketchbook, its pages pristine beneath my fingers as I nestled by the firelight. My pencil glided, coaxing contours into life that blossomed across the sheet, a fresh dream unfurling under my sure touch. The embers cast a warm sheen over the arcs and lines, illuminating a path I'd hewn from the embers of his collapse. And I smiled, the burden of his reign dissolved by the art I'd revived. This wasn't his downfall that shaped me, but the light I'd summoned, a tapestry spun from my own hands, unmarred by the gales he'd unleashed. The night thickened beyond, the stars etching a boundless vault above, and I rested in that stillness, my soul aglow with a tranquility I'd claimed, step by steadfast step. Reflecting on it all, I've learned that trust can be a delicate strand, swiftly unraveled by those we cherish most, yet it's our own resilience that rethreads the fabric. Marcus showed me betrayal's bite, but my quiet defiance, those midnight drafts, those captured whispers, wove a life unbreakable by his tumult. Life may hurl storms our way, but it's the strength to rise from their debris that defines us, if we choose to seize it. I found solace not in his collapse, but in the light I forged, a truth that we outshine the darkness cast over us. What do you think? Have you wrestled with a shattered trust, a lesson born from the rubble? I'm eager to hear your tales, your victories, your falters below. Drop your thoughts, and let's craft something fresh together. Until next time, may you kindle your own spark amid the winds. See you soon in your own tales.